This morning's scripture is from Ephesians 5:15 through 21. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ.
We're going to dwell a little bit in the text that we were in last week and introduce the text that will further address next week. But so we're kind of on a transitional passage, and I'm really excited about it. And hopefully you see why I'm drawing the conclusions I am today. I want to just acknowledge three people, and they're mentioned in chapter 19, 38, to the first two verses of 20. There's three people. Just grab them. You're going to see Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and Mary Magdalene. So let me read the text first, starting in verse 38 of chapter 19. After these things, so after the death of Jesus, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Character 2, Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. That's a lot. That's a lot. Verse 40. So they took the body, they being Nicodemus and Joseph, and probably likely some of their servants. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen clothes with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. So because the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Some time goes by. Verse 1 of chapter 20, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, we believe to be John, so Peter and John, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Now, last week we acknowledged some of the immediate results of the death of Jesus and long-term results of the death of Jesus. And next week we'll look at some of the ramifications of the resurrection of Jesus. This week we're not looking at any theological point or really even the death to the resurrection. We're looking at these three people. I like football. I'm a football fan. I'm probably more of a high school football fan than I am a pro football fan. But I like football. 11 players, each from two separate teams, make up the players on a football field at any given time. I'm not trying to mansplain right now, by the way. Just laying out a concept, okay? Each team has 11 players to work with on the field, and every advancement up the field must come from these 11 players. Now, of course, there are players on the sidelines, additional players on the sidelines, and there are coaches, and there may be a couple of managers. For Waterloo's JV team, Ryan and Dakota's team, there's about 15 total. There's usually about 4 guys on the sideline. Like, we can't have any injuries, right? So there's 15 to 16 players total, 11 on the field, 4 or 5 on the sideline. Whatever is going to happen on the football field will only happen with those football players, right? There's coaches, but they're not going to jump in. There's the water boy. He's not going to throw on some pads and jump in. Now let me connect this to John's gospel, and you're probably being like, how? So by means of a rather silly metaphor, I see Jesus' disciples as the team. And what luck, there's 11 of them. That wasn't what made me think of football, probably. So at this point in John's gospel, 11 disciples make up the team. They're accompanied by a group of women who have faithfully followed Jesus throughout his ministry. So my concept at this point is, if someone is going to care for Jesus in this moment, someone from this group is going to have to do it. That would probably be what most of us would be thinking. Here's the problem. The whole team left the field. Right? The disciples fled. Really, you got the captain that hung out, and he's still at the foot of the cross, John. That's it. We only see one player present, and some of the women. So all the disciples have fled. They're not available to accomplish an important task. There's a group of women who do not have access to Pilate to access the body, to ask for the body. And telling the women to acquire the body for burial would be about as successful as telling the water boy to defeat the other team by throwing on a helmet and going out and playing by himself. However, important matters need to be tended to. Jesus' body needed to be taken down. Jesus' body needed to be buried that same day, according to the law. And additionally, specific prophetic statements must be fulfilled. For instance, the Messiah would be buried in the tomb of a rich man. Here's the problem. The only people we would consider willing and able to care for Jesus' body are incapable of doing so. Metaphorically speaking, John, at least from John's perspective, God pulls together a second team. Before now, we've never heard the name Joseph of Arimathea. Nicodemus is only present in John's gospel. None of the other gospel writers ever acknowledge Nicodemus. And the two times prior to this, in chapter 3 and in chapter 7, you would probably be hard-pressed to conclude that, yes, Nicodemus is going to play an integral role in Jesus' life. So he's probably not a character we would have guessed would be stepping in to help out. Mary Magdalene is significantly more acknowledged throughout the Gospels and in this Gospel, but of all the women that are following, she might not have probably been the most likely character to be pointed out here. She was the one that was demon-possessed by many demons and had them cast out, and she had been faithfully following Jesus through his ministry. And somehow God in his providence worked in all three of their lives to bring them to this specific spiritual and geographical point to care for the body of Christ, and in the exact manner in which God had determined long before, as we'll address in just a moment in Isaiah 700 years earlier. There's no level of detail, minuscule as it may appear, in which God has not sovereignly orchestrated every moment. Both who will perform the task and in what manner the task will be performed. Let me draw your attention to this. God always provides for the fulfillment of his promises through instruments of his choosing. God always provides for the fulfillment of his promises through instruments of his choosing. There are three unlikely characters in these short verses. The first unlikely character is Joseph of Arimathea. Each of the gospel authors actually mention Joseph of Arimathea, and their combined information reveal that he was a wealthy man who held a respectable position on the council, likely the Sanhedrin. Both Matthew and John refer to him as a disciple of Jesus. Mark reveals that Joseph of Arimathea, was also himself looking for the kingdom of God. That's how Mark describes him. Luke refers to him as a good and righteous man. So he's a rich man, he's a righteous man, he's a disciple of Jesus, he's part of the Sanhedrin. All four of the gospel accounts indicate that Joseph approached Pilate to request to take Jesus' body, and Pilate grants this request. Possibly, we read in extra-biblical literature, in fact, apocryphal literature, that Joseph was considered a friend of Pilate. The author of the apocryphal writing, the Gospel of Peter, states that Joseph was the friend of Pilate and of the Lord. That's how he describes it. Now, we can't know for sure. It might help explain why he had access to Pilate at this point, though. The section that it says this, but of the Jews no man washed his hands, neither did Herod nor any of his judges, and whereas they would not wash, Pilate rose up. And then Herod the king commanded that the Lord should be taken into their hands, saying unto them, all that I commanded you to do unto him, do ye. Now there stood there Joseph, the friend of Pilate and of the Lord, and he, knowing that they were about to crucify him, came unto Pilate and begged the body of Jesus for burial. Either way, whether that apocryphal writing is accurate or not, we're not sure, but either way, Joseph gathered up the courage to request the body of Jesus so that he could appropriately bury Jesus. And John acknowledged that Joseph secretly followed Jesus because he was afraid of the Jews. Yet Mark states that he took up courage and he approached Pilate. This act would likely reveal his affinity for Jesus and would out him as a disciple, right? If he's secretly been a disciple up to this point and he's going to come publicly and take the body of Jesus and bury him, he's basically acknowledging publicly now that he was a disciple of Jesus. Carson writes in his commentary that Joseph's act doubtless made him a pariah in some quarters of the Sanhedrin. It was doubly courageous since the charge under which Jesus had been executed was sedition. Joseph, a leader, a rich leader of the Jews, publicly claimed the body of a criminal so that he could bury him. And he was buried him according to the law. The evidence offered by the gospel authors revealed Joseph desired to bury Jesus due to his being a disciple of Jesus. However, possibly, Jesus probably would have been buried either way. He would have been buried quickly, and he would have been buried in one of the criminal burial places. There were two of them. They weren't far from this place, and they probably would have been buried there. In fact, Deuteronomy says, a body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. So this is the law that the Jews would have felt compelled to obey. They would have not have buried him in a place of honor at all. They would have buried him in one of these two criminal burial spots. Once again, the Gospel of Peter unfolds that Herod informed Pilate, even if none had begged for him, we should have buried him, since also the Sabbath dawneth. For it is written in the law that the sun should not set upon one that hath been slain. The Mishnah confirms this when it writes, the deceased to stay unburied overnight is a transgression of a negative commandment. So they had to bury Jesus that night. So likely Jesus would have been buried. The Jews would have buried him in a graveyard set for the occasion. What's interesting, if you go to John 19, verse 42. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Now we know from the other gospel authors, not from John, that this tomb was Joseph's. Right? So we know that Joseph buries Jesus in his tomb. What does John imply, though? John doesn't even tell us that he buried him in Joseph's tomb. Why do they bury him in this tomb? Because the day of preparation was coming, the tomb was close at hand. They were running out of time, they had to bury him. It just so happened, providentially so, that the person who had, by God's providence, designed and had a relationship with Pilate to ask for the body, acquired the body, was able to take the body, had to bury it that evening, happened to be a rich man, happened to have the closest tomb available to the cross, and was able to bury him in his own tomb because they were running out of time and wouldn't have been able to make it some other place that they probably had designed to bury Jesus. And they bury him there, in so doing, fulfill a prophecy that God had made 700 plus years earlier. Could anyone have navigated that? Joseph of Arimathea had a life outside of Jerusalem. God in his providence orchestrated that Joseph would come to Jerusalem. It said that this tomb was a new tomb and had been hewn out. So it seems as relatively in the recent past, Joseph of Arimathea had moved from some place, probably his hometown, to Jerusalem. Maybe he had taken a position in the Sanhedrin at this time. We don't know, but now he seems to live in Jerusalem. He's like, I got to have a tomb. He had recently formed a tomb for himself, and it just happened to be the closest tomb available for Jesus to be buried in. And it happened to be a rich man's tomb, and it happened to fulfill prophecy exactly the way God had designed. Nicodemus is our second unlikely character. We would know nothing of Nicodemus had the Apostle John not mentioned him on 3 different occasions in his gospel. Like, think through the 3 occasions that bring us to chapter 19. What's the first one? Chapter 3, first Nick at night. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, and some would argue, like Carson argues, that this was not actually in the evening as much as it was in the darkness of his own sinfulness. He comes in the darkness, or still in spiritual darkness. I don't think that's the case. A number of others conclude otherwise. I think he actually came at night. I think he was afraid. He was interested. He was curious, but he was afraid of what it would look like if he were to come to Jesus publicly, boldly, during the day where people could see him. So he sneaks, and at night he comes and he talks to Jesus, and they have this discussion about birth. And Nicodemus is confused, and Jesus is not astonished, but he acts astonished. How are you, a leader of the law, unable to understand these concepts? And we're left in chapter 3 having introduced to us this character of Nicodemus. Now, we as believers in the 21st century are very well aware of Nicodemus, and we kind of have a positive view of him probably. But if we could step away from our awareness of him and go back to just chapter 3, and that's all the information we have of Nicodemus, we would probably not be concluding necessarily that he was going to be a disciple of Jesus. Interested, seeking, but not necessarily a disciple. Chapter 7 comes along. The religious leaders send some soldiers to take Jesus. The soldiers are enamored by Jesus, and they come back, and the religious leaders say, so where's Jesus? And they're like, no one has spoke like this man has spoken. And Nicodemus, in that moment in chapter 7, he says, does our law judge a man without giving him a hearing and learning what he does? That's all Nicodemus says. That's all. The introduction of chapter 7 of Nicodemus wouldn't necessarily draw us to conclude, wow, Nicodemus is a disciple of Jesus. He just asked the simple question, like, is this against the law? Like, the way we're going about this, there may be a better way to do this. And what do they charge him with? They reply, the religious leaders, to Nicodemus. So probably Nicodemus is a little bit annoyed at this point. They reply, are you from Galilee too? Search and see what no prophet arises from Galilee. They mockingly accuse him of being from Galilee. Like, are you from Waterloo? Have you ever studied anything ever in your life, Nicodemus? Like, an honored leader of the Sanhedrin is put in his place by his question. Now, let me draw your attention back to John 3. There is an indication in John 3. He says, we. Now, let me go back to John 3. I think it's in verse 2. there was a man, first verse, the man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. He came by night and said to the rabbi, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God. Now, we can't know this with certainty, but there's evidence there that there's a group of people within the religious leaders. There's a group of people, maybe a small group of people within the Sanhedrin. If we were to speculate a little bit, it would be probably fairly informed speculation to say that both Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, part of the Sanhedrin, had heard sympathies from one another towards Jesus. And maybe in chapter 3 of John, when Nicodemus says, we have heard this, he's referring to Joseph of Arimathea and maybe a couple others, maybe. But there seems to be some in the Sanhedrin that are sympathetic to the things that Jesus has said and the things that Jesus has done. But still, at the end of chapter 7, you might think Nicodemus is a kind, sensitive, legal scholar. You would still not conclude that he was a disciple of Jesus. We only do because we know the whole story. At the end of chapter 7, that's not necessarily the conclusion. But in the same way that Joseph of Arimathea definitely private or publicizes his discipleship of Jesus in this act of burial, so does Nicodemus. And you come to chapter 19 again, and you see in verse 39, Nicodemus also. And John points back to chapter 3, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, served Jesus. Nicodemus is a disciple of Jesus. We would know nothing of this character. Now, I'm going to mention Mary Magdalene in just a second, but to kind of even introduce her to some degree, I was struggling with should I dwell further on the death of Jesus Christ and the theological implications of the death of Jesus, or jump into the theological implications of the resurrection, the historical background of the resurrection. And as I was sitting here, studying the passage, these three characters grabbed my attention. And I wondered, why did John include them? Like, he was purposeful in it, right? Like, he purposed to include Nicodemus in chapter 3 and in chapter 7 to lay some foundation for why he's in chapter 19. No other gospel author indicates the reality of Nicodemus. Why does John include him? That struck me. Why is Nicodemus only in John? And why does John include him? It also struck me as I introduced Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was one of many women. If you read through the other Gospels, she's only one of the group in all the other Gospels. So in other Gospels, it mentions Mary Magdalene. It mentions Mary. It mentions Salome, Joanna, and other women in one of the Gospels. There's a group of women. We have no idea the number of them, but there's at least 4, if not 5, 6, 7, that are part of this burial moment, this time of coming to the tomb at the day of resurrection. Why does John only include Mary Magdalene? He doesn't mention any of the others. If you were to come to John, you would draw the conclusion that Mary Magdalene by herself came to the tomb. And we know that she didn't because the other Gospels indicate otherwise. Why did John choose to only mention her? Why did John choose to only mention Nicodemus? Now, Joseph of Arimathea is in all of them, so it would make sense that he, like the other Gospel authors, would include him. But why are these two characters in here? Well, hopefully I'll answer that question. But before I do, let's look at Mary Magdalene, the third unlikely character, for just a moment. Luke initially acknowledges this generic presence, and I'll probably recap what I just said a little bit here. This generic presence of a group of women at the crucifixion doesn't mention their names at all. He briefly discusses the presence at the tomb. He doesn't mention their names. It's only after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, that Luke mentions Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and other women. Matthew and Mark indicate Mary was part and with other women. The gospel authors reveal little about Mary Magdalene. Luke offers one helpful fact. Mary was part of a large group of women who provided for Jesus. Additionally, Luke reveals she had been healed of 7 demons, likely by Jesus. One author writes, Mary's solitary presence at the tomb is an example of Johannine dramatization, but the evangelist further exploits the tradition about her in an eight-verse narrative where a scene is set at the tomb itself. The narrative, without parallel in the Synoptic Gospels, contains the only 2 New Testament passages in which Mary Magdalene is simply called Mary. She goes and she runs to Simon Peter and John to tell them that they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Next, John reveals Mary's presence as she weeps at the tomb, and she fails to recognize Jesus. And yet, once finally Jesus reveals himself to her, Mary believes and declares to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. These are the 3 characters that we see in John's burial section. To what end? Why do you think John included them? I think, not to oversimplify this, but I think John intended to show that God uses unlikely characters. Now, unlikely from our perspective, not his. To be honest, all of us are unlikely characters. But from our perspective, I think we can tend to draw the conclusion of who God is going to use. We see the type of people we think God is going to use, and we're like, if anything's going to be done, it's going to be done by them. And God, I think in this instance, John reveals God uses all kinds of people. And I think he draws all kinds of people. So John's purpose, 20:31, I've written these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and in believing you will have life through his name. That's his purpose. And then he shows, here are some people, the kind of people that believe. And they're not necessarily the kind of people you would expect. I think that's beautiful. There's 2 things, I think, realities that I draw from this, and hopefully they're encouraging to you. You may draw something other than this, but I'm sure there's more. But there's 2 things. God often provides through unlikely characters. At the beginning of the message, I said God always provides for the fulfillment of his promises through instruments of his choosing. God will always provide for his plan, right? So one thing to take home today, God often provides through unlikely characters. It's only in John that we're privy to the reality of Nicodemus. No one else mentions him. The 12 disciples, 11 disciples at this point, may not have even been aware of Nicodemus. They may not have known even of his twilight meeting with Jesus. In other words, Nicodemus was on no one's radar as the guy who would step in when something was needed to be done for Jesus. However, God all along intended to prepare, equip, and position Nicodemus in a position that he could do something to accomplish and facilitate Jesus' burial in accordance with the Scriptures. Years earlier, God began a work in Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph moves to Jerusalem, establishes himself in the Sanhedrin, interacts with Nicodemus to some degree and level, buys a new tomb, and is rich. And God orchestrates the positioning of this single man so that his prophecy that the Messiah would be buried in a rich man's tomb would come to fulfillment. This orchestration, God's orchestration in these 2 men's lives reminds me of Abraham and Isaac's ascent up Mount Moriah. And Isaac turns and asks Abraham, where is the lamb or the ram for the sacrifice? And Abraham says God will provide. But if you were just in Abraham and Isaac's story, and in fact the whole story, the whole narrative is about them, and it centers on them, and they travel from a far place, and they come to the mountain, and they go up the mountain. And none of that is the story B told, where there was a ram that had to get to this point at some place. That sounds like a great children's story. There's this ram, and somehow he got caught in a thicket. Stinks for him. But there's that there's that backdrop of the story all along. Like God all along, while we are hearing and watching this story unfold, God had to be working in this other dimension, in essence. To draw this ram to this spot, why was he there? Why is he stuck? Because God in his providence provides for his plan to be fulfilled. So we look at the Gospels and we see the life of Jesus and we see the 11 disciples and we see the women that are gathered around. We don't see the thousands of other people in the background that God is working through and navigating through their life and drawing them to himself, so that in the exact moment of his purpose, these two men who no one knew inside the story of the Gospels step up and accomplish the purpose God had so ordained to do. Aren't you glad? As we sit here and we look at our life of Waterloo and its area cities, and this is the story in which we find ourselves, that God's not limited to this story, that everything in God's divine will isn't going to happen because we are the team and that's the only people who can fulfill it, that God is working outside of us. And even if we were to look in a smaller thing in Waterloo, that there are people God is working in and drawing to himself, that at some point he is going to accomplish his divine purpose through them, and we may have no idea of their existence. Too often in my life I've thought that if something of a spiritual nature were to be done in my home or my children, in our community, in our church, it would have to be done by us or by me. We're the team on the field. That's stupid. It's nonsense and it's arrogance. God can, at any time, immediately remove any one of us and have absolutely no problem immediately filling the position. Have you ever thought, like, God, you better keep me here because what will happen otherwise? He's not going to struggle. Like, we're not indispensable people. And aren't you glad that you're not indispensable? That God's plan is not foiled by the lack of your presence, the lack of my presence? I'm glad the health of a church, the health of the church, is not dependent on a group of people, a specific man or a specific woman or a specific whatever it might be.